we are going to discuss today. We are going to discuss an important topic. It is interesting as well. Which is one of the common symptoms we can see in not only in palliative care patients but also in any other medical specialties. And if you are working in ICU, it should be familiar to you. Delirium, it has more prevalence in palliative care patients because of many reasons. So today's the session will be handled by Dr. Rajeshri. So Madam is basically she's an anesthetist, but she has been working in palliative care for last more than 25 years. And presently she's working as faculty at Amrita Institute of Medical Sciences, and she's also working at Pain and Palliative Care Society at Thrissur, and she's also the academic director of Trivandrum Institute of Palliative Sciences. So, Madam, welcome you, and it's over to you.
Good afternoon. Am I audible?
Yes, madam.
Okay. So, welcome to the session, and thank you, Sunil, for the nice introduction. I am honored to share my knowledge with a rather challenging topic, not only in palliative care and also in general healthcare setting, as Dr. Sunil has rightly pointed out. So I welcome you all for sparing your precious time during this devastating time of COVID-19. So though we had named it as COVID-19, it is extending extending its grip through 20 to 21. So delirium is particularly important in COVID patients as well, because many patients who are admitted in ICU, they give, a very, very frightful experience, which they had experienced in the ICU because of horrendous delirium. So we are not going to that, the kind of delirium experience which the patient have had in COVID patients have had in ICU, but we are going to have an overview of delirium, which is a rather common clinical presentation in almost all healthcare scenario. So Arun, can I share the presentation from my end?
Yes, ma'am, you can share. If you have any technical difficulty, you share from our side.
So going on to the topic. So let us look at a clinical situation.
Sorry,
Am I audible?
Ma'am, you are audible, but your screen is not visible.
Sorry?
It says started screen sharing, but PowerPoint has not come yet. Still
So
in the process.
Could you please switch off my video? I am not able to.
Okay.
Okay, ma'am.
Is it okay now?
No, ma'am. Can you stop sharing and do it once again?
Oh, fine. I will do that. Okay. So before going into the top directly, we are going to have a clinical situation, okay, which we rather come across. Quite commonly. Next slide, please. So here, an elderly woman is brought to the emergency room with complaints of altered behavior noticed by the family members for the past 2 days. She is talking incoherently and appears confused. Note that she is diabetic and hypertensive and is reported to be well controlled on metformin and glimepiride and losartan and hydrochlorothiazide respectively. And she also has been complaining of burning micturition and increased frequency of urination for a couple of days. Family has noted that her oral intake for the past 1 week is low. Next. So we will be coming back to the clinical situation towards the end of the presentation. So we will come to the definition of delirium. So it is a transient organic brain syndrome characterized by acute onset of global cerebral dysfunction with disturbances in psychomotor behavior. Each word of this long definition is particularly significant. Not that it is transient and acute. You know that transient by the word means it comes and goes off, and acute means it occurs rather suddenly. It is organic because there can be a dictatable cause behind the clinical presentation. It is not something purely psychiatric. Though delirium is common in psychiatric patients, delirium per se is not a psychiatric presentation alone. It is not purely a psychiatric condition. It has got an organic cause. It is a syndrome rather than a clinical symptom. And it is characterized by cerebral dysfunction at all levels. We know that our cortex, cerebral cortex, controls most of the cognitive behavior, attention, orientation, concentration, memory, perception, interpretation, everything. So that means almost all modalities or all faculty of cortical function, it gets affected with delirium. And it is always associated with disturbance or alterations in psychomotor behavior. That means patient's motor activity will be abnormal, and his, like the external or the outward behavior also will appear aberrant. Next. So these are the facts with respect to delirium. It affects 28% to 83% of the hospital admission. So it is a wide range. So it could be as low as 28% or as high as 83%. Okay. And it is reversible. That is particularly interesting. It is reversible in more than 50% of the cases. And it definitely affects quality of life, and it increases morbidity and hospital stay. Even after the postoperative conditions are set in well, if the patient is delirious, the surgeon will not be able to discharge the patient home because it is not a condition with which patient can be sent home. So definitely it results in morbidity and prolonged hospital stay. It causes distress among family members because they won't be understanding what is happening to their loved one. And also it poses challenges in diagnosis with respect to diagnosis and management for the professionals. Next slide. Before going to the impact, I would like to clarify, like if the patient is at home, it is interesting to note that only less than 30% of the individual, probably 10 to 20% of the patients will experience delirium towards end of life phase. The incidence is, definitely below 30%, maybe close to 20% or so. So if the patient gets admitted to a ward, definitely the risk of developing delirium will increase from 30% to it will increase to close to 60%. If the patient gets admitted to the ICU, that is with respect to end of life phase, delirium is so common that it affects almost 90% of the individuals. I am talking about delirium towards end of life phase. So it is that, common in the hospital setting. So what is the impact? There is definite functional decline because there is impairment in cognition as well as impairment in mobility, because the patient may lose the visual spatial orientation. So mobility will be restricted. So because of that, because of the cognitive impairment and the mobility restriction, he or she is likely to sustain a fall resulting in fracture. So there will be incontinence, both urinary and fecal, and failure to maintain adequate hydration and nutrition because patient will not be in a position to cooperate with the nutritive supplements or the fluids, which either the family or the hospital staff are providing. And the patient, because of the irritability and restlessness, either, restrained either physically by just tying to the bed rails, or chemically by using sedatives. And it increases in prolonged hospital stay, and it causes emotional burden to the patient, family, and the caring team. Because a patient who had come out of delirium and they had later recalled their experience as so distressing. Okay, and the family, as we had already discussed with the previous slide, it causes a lot of emotional issues. And the caring team also poses challenges because of managing complex syndrome. They also will be having, distress while managing the patient, because as healthcare professionals, our primary intent is to help the patient to come out of the illness rather quickly. Delirium poses a challenge to that quick recovery. So definitely it is a challenge for the health professionals. And if the appropriate cause for the delirium is not rightly identified, it may result in death. That causes we will see shortly. And delirium, what happens is in hypoactive delirium, that also we will be discussing soon. It is quite often mistaken for depression because the patient will be hypoactive and lethargic. Next slide, please. So what causes delirium and what happens to brain? It is called, like a neuronal or brain insult, which results in neuronal instability. There is imbalance in the neurotransmitter system, which balance the cognitive function, particularly dopamine, gamma aminobutyric acid, and acetylcholine. And there is imbalance also noted in 5-hydroxytryptamine, that is serotonin. And there is endorphin hyperfunction.
What are the hospitals like?
Hello? Hello?
Ma'am, you can continue, ma'am.
There is no problem from my side, no?
No, not from your side, ma'am. Someone.
And there is imbalance noted in with respect to serotonin, endorphin, noradrenaline, and also there is evidence that there will be damaged in the neuronal enzyme system. So it is so complex that delirium presents in a challenging manner. Next. So let us look at the causative factors. I have categorized the causative factors broadly into 3 because delirium is primarily a neuronal or cerebral dysfunction. The first category is direct central nervous system causes. So there are primary causes as to like vascular incidents which happens in the brain, like ischemia, hemorrhage, hematoma formation following a trauma or something like that. Or it could be infections pertaining to central nervous system, meningitis or encephalitis. So these are primary CNS causes. There can be secondary causes like metabolic dysfunctions, like hyperglycemia, hypoglycemia, hyponatremia, hyperkalemia, uremia. So any organ dysfunction producing metabolic disturbance, which secondarily affects brain. And there is hypertension. Hypertension is not a, it is not a CNS problem. It is primarily a cardiovascular problem. Cardiovascular problem like hypertension causing some vascular malformation or vascular disturbance or hypertensive encephalopathy like thing or microinfarct or whatever it is. These are secondary causes. Next. There are general causes as well. Old age. Old age is, it is a threat, or it's something like if two people, they are having infection like encephalitis or meningitis or something like that, sepsis. An older person is more susceptible or more vulnerable to have delirium, because old age is a susceptible factor for developing delirium. Infections like generalized sepsis, pneumonia, and urinary tract infection in particular can cause delirium. drug withdrawal like alcohol, narcotics, and hallucinogens, deficiency states anemia with vitamin B1, thiamine deficiency, and vitamin B12, and endocrine abnormalities like hypothyroidism and Cushing syndrome, and autoimmune diseases like systemic lupus erythematosus. Next slide. Let us have the third category like drugs, steroids, opioids, anticholinergic medications like glycopyrrolate, hyoscine, butyl bromide, benzodiazepine, and certain chemotherapeutic agents, phenothiazines, and antiviral drugs. See, many drugs which we use commonly in palliative care are likely to produce delirium. Opioids, steroids, anticholinergic, etc. So we have to be quite aware of the drug history of the patient. So it is very important that we have to note down what all drugs the patient has been taking and what all drugs he had been taking in the past and now currently he is not on, because drug withdrawal also can lead to delirium that we have seen with alcohol. So drugs, either administration or withdrawal, can cause delirium. Next slide. Now we can look at precipitating factors. Previous factors like A, B, C were the causative factors. These are the precipitating factors like pain. Any patient in pain is likely to have experienced delirium. Either urinary or fecal retention can cause, precipitate delirium, and anxiety and fear associated with disease and treatment also can predispose to delirium. Next slide. So there is an acronym. There are a lot of acronym, pinch me, and many other things. But I have found this one useful. So delirium for delirium. So D is drugs and alcohol. Any recent changes? As we had seen, opioids, benzos, antipsychotics, anticholinergics. So any drugs which are recently commenced. E for electrolytes, hyponatremia, acute kidney injury producing uremia, hypercalcemia, or hypoglycemia. L is lack of drugs. We had already discussed either new administration of drugs or withdrawal of drugs. So lack of drugs, pain. If the patient had been on analgesics, if these had been recently taken away, or withdrawal of drugs like alcohol, okay, and recent dose reductions also. Infection, it's not only UTI, like pneumonia or any other sepsis. Remember, fever may be typically absent in older people. And reduced sensory input if the patient is not able to read, write, and hear properly. And it is very important in elderly people because they need sensory aids like spectacles or hearing aids. When these are taken away in a hospital setting, remember that this can precipitate or predispose delirium. Because any elderly person in an unfamiliar setting like hospital environment without a sensory aid will be in a disturbed condition or disturbed ambience. I for intracranial pathology, tumor or hematoma, infections or any other vascular events like infarcts or hemorrhage. And U for urinary or fecal retention, and M for medical causes like any medical condition like myocardial infarction or congestive cardiac failure or COPD exacerbation or liver or renal failure, and any condition producing hypoxia. So remember delirium for delirium. This is particularly relevant in elderly people. Next slide, please. So there are different types of delirium: hypoactive, hyperactive, mixed pattern, and refractory. It is termed refractory because it is not easily treatable or manageable with our conventional drugs, which usually occurs towards end of life phase. Let's see what is hyperactive delirium. The patient will be combative, agitated, restless. So it is very difficult to control the patient. These are the category of patients where we use either physical or chemical restraints. Whereas hypoactive delirium, it is quite often missed because the patient will be comfortable, quiet, and will not be complaining of anything. And sometimes he will be drowsy, somnolent, or unarousable. And the family also will, will not be able to recognize. They will have a feeling that the patient is comfortable and he's sleeping fine. So this could be a delirium. So this is hypoactive delirium. So on the other hand, the pattern could be mixed, like alert and calm. I mean, waxing and waning, and it will have a mixed presentation in mixed type. Next slide, please. So what are the clinical features? The attention will be poor. The patient will not be able to attend to a thing so that he will be able to focus on it and then recall it. So impairment in short-term memory, disorientation, that means patient will not be in a position to orient himself or herself into place, person, and time. So this is how, I mean, you may ask the patient, where are you now? Where is your house? What is the address? What is the time? And again, the time is particularly important in a hospital setting because of the curtain and the pullouts. The light will not be natural at all. Okay, and in ICU, it is always well lit, so the patient will not be able to identify whether it is daytime or night. But still, we can ask them where they are. That is a question, okay, and their names, okay, and the address, and their wife's or spouse name, and the children's name. These are the things which we can ask. And the patient can have hallucination, okay, and they will see and, I mean, very rarely hear things which are not actually present. Auditory hallucination, it is not very typical of organic delirium. It is usually seen with psychiatric patients, but visual hallucination is very common in hospital admitted patients. And the speech will be irrelevant, rambling, and incoherent, and we will not be able to understand what they are exactly talking. And in hyperactive delirium, patient will be aggressive, agitated, and restless. Whereas in hypoactive delirium, patient's response will be sluggish and the patient may appear lethargic or somnolent. Next. We need to see how delirium difference, it's differ from dementia. Definitely delirium can occur in a demented patient, but delirium is always abrupt in onset, whereas dementia is insidious, slow. And altered level of consciousness will be present. That is a hallmark of delirium, whereas level of consciousness will be intact in dementia. And sleep-wake cycle is affected in delirium because the patient may sleep during the daytime and remain awake in the night. And dementia, the variation is very minimal. If at all it is there, it is seen towards advanced state of dementia. And delirium is usually reversible except in terminal or end-of-life phase, whereas dementia, it is termed irreversible, but that irreversible term is not very well fitting to dementia with the current concept. And the reversibility is there with certain kind of vascular dementia or dementia associated with brain tumors and endocrine dysfunction. So whereas in Alzheimer's disease, dementia is irreversible. Next. So assessment, coming to assessment, we cannot diagnose delirium over phone. We have to see patient in person, not on an online mode. It is okay in the present situation. We can have a video call and see how the patient is doing. And actually it is meant to be done at the bedside. And it has to be done daily at the regular intervals. Not that you have done in the morning and we cannot think that the assessment it is meant for entire 24 hours. That is not possible because we have seen that it is waxing and waning. So we have to make assessment at periodic intervals. This is very important because nocturnal presentation will be missed because of the family caregivers will be sleeping and the nursing professionals are also will be less vigilant. So, I mean, if the patient is a candidate who is susceptible or vulnerable to have delirium, please keep a regular chart for visiting and frequent assessment. And here history from the caregivers is is very important, because patient will not be in a position to answer promptly to our questions. So we can ask the caregivers to give a clear history as to how was the onset, when did it exactly commence. So all those things we can, whether they had any previous episodes similar to this, these kind of details we can elicit from the caregivers. Next slide. The standard assessment is through Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th version criteria. So they have come out with 5 cardinal features. There should be disturbance in attention and awareness. The patient will not be, cannot focus his attention to a particular object, and he will be, there will be, affected or impaired awareness about the, surroundings or the ambience. And it is abrupt in onset with fluctuation in severity of symptoms, because it might be very prominent in the night, and it is much less towards the morning hours, and again peaks afternoon, and again goes down in the evening, and again peaks in the night. So there will be waxing and waning, change in cognition as to disturbance in orientation, perception, interpretation, and memory. And it is not better in terms of other neurocognitive disorder. We cannot say that this patient behaves like this because he had some other neurodegenerative conditions like, motor neuron disease or Parkinsonism or multiple sclerosis. No, there is no cause like that for this patient to behave like this. So there is no other neurocognitive disorder occurring to the patient in the past or in the present. And there is evidence of medical condition just to be etiologically related to disturbance. So if the patient is behaving in an abnormal fashion, and if you can find that there is low blood sugar level or low sodium level or high calcium level, so there is a clinical or medical correlation. So attention, awareness, abrupt onset, fluctuation in severity of symptoms, change in cognitive faculty, and not better explained in terms of other neurodegenerative or neurocognitive disorder, and there is evidence of a medical or clinical condition. Next. Whereas DSM stands as a gold standard assessment for delirium, we cannot go with DSM criteria to a patient to assess delirium. So we have different tools. So we have mini mental status examination, that is MMSE, that is principally for assessing cognitive disturbance. It assesses orientation, registration, attention and calculation, recall, and language and praxis. 5 components. Okay, orientation, registration, attention and calculation, recall, language and praxis. And there are 5 components. Total score is 30. And if the score obtained for the individual is less than 20, that shows there is severe cognitive impairment. And MMSE is not a diagnostic tool. It is meant only to assess the cognitive derangement. There are screening and diagnostic tools as well. That is confusion assessment method, that is CAM, and memorial delirium assessment scale, that is MDAS. And there is another tool for severity assessment, delirium rating scale. These are the different tools which are used to assess the cognitive disturbance, and it is used for diagnosis and also to grade severity. Next slide. So with respect to tools, we have one more, that is 480 delirium assessment tool. This is another tool which is used for assessing and screening delirium with respect to alertness and, with the ability of the patient to reorient himself, and also assessing attention and acute change in the fluctuating course. And if it is scored as 004, 012, and 012 like that, and no is scored always as 0, and yes is scored as 4. And if the score is 4 or above, there is possibility of delirium, and the patient should be put in the delirium pathway. And if the score is between 1 and 3, there is a possibility of cognitive impairment. So the patient has to be monitored vigilantly, so that whether he will be shifting or he will be just drifting to delirium. And there is CAM also, confusion assessment method, which shows acute onset and fluctuating course, inattention and distractibility, and disorganized thinking and alteration in consciousness. So according to CAM, diagnosis of delirium requires the presence of both features of 1 and 2. So that means acute onset, fluctuating course, inattention and distractibility must be present, plus either disorganized thinking or alteration of consciousness. That is the diagnostic criteria for confusion assessment algorithm. Next slide. So investigations, do we investigate? Investigations are meant to assess the need. That means to assess what is the clinical condition or the medical condition pushing the patient into delirium. This will directly support us for diagnosis and also to plan our management. So investigations are avoided in the terminal stage because they are going to be futile. So routine blood examination, like renal function, glucose, electrolytes, complete blood count and liver function, urine routine examination, and CT head only if it is, requested from the side of the primary consultant. Otherwise, from palliative medicine alone, we will not ask for a CT head unless it is demanded by the primary consultant, like oncologist or general medical, internist or psychiatrist who is treating the patient. So remember, routine blood examination and urine examination must be done where we think delirium definitely has a cause and it can be reversible. Next slide. Coming to management, principles of management, there are general measures and pharmacological measures. Pharmacological measures are, like etiologically oriented interventions, like correct the correctables. So if that is delirium occurs from hypoglycemia, that should be corrected. Hyponatremia or hypercalcemia, that should be corrected. Sepsis should be treated. Urine should be, bladder should be emptied, and the pain should be managed, and the rectum should be emptied. And all those aspects must be carried out. And there are other pharmacological measures like antipsychotics, benzodiazepines, and it includes sedation and end of life phase. Next slide. Like general measures are equally important or sometimes more important than the pharmacological measures. And this has to be learned by medical professionals like us, and it has to be taught, and the nursing faculty or the nursing fraternity should be empowered to take care of all these aspects. Stop offending treatment or cause. I understand that a nurse cannot stop a particular treatment in Indian healthcare practice system, but definitely nurse can follow a track, like doctor, only after giving this medicine, he or she started behaving like this. This is a cue which like a nursing colleague can give to you, and correct the metabolic abnormalities in conjunction or respecting order of the physician. Structured setting like quiet room, low voltage light means avoid bright light, calendar and clock for the patient to be oriented, and avoid watch shifts if possible. Okay. And sensory aids should be provided to the patient. Encourage visit by the friends and relatives, at least in the step down ICU. It may not be possible in a medical oriented, ICU, typical ICU setting, but in a semi ICU or step down ICU, it may be practiced. Less physical restraints and early mobilization. This is very important. If the patient is tied to the bed railings, and if you are giving benzodiazepine to calm down the patient, that is going to worsen the situation. And care of the bladder, bowel, and pressure ulcers. Management of pain, address fear or anxiety, maintain adequate hydration, and ensure family support. This is very important because the family will be waiting outside if the patient is admitted in the ICU, and it is our responsibility and duty that what is happening to the patient should be explained properly to the family members. Next slide, please. Coming to the pharmacological measures, there are two categories: antipsychotics and benzodiazepines. Antipsychotics are the drugs of choice, and the typical antipsychotic is the potent dopamine antagonist, haloperidol, 1 to 2 milligram every 4 hourly, or SOS, that is PRN, either orally, that is could be difficult in a delirious patient, subcutaneously or intravenously. And remember, subcutaneous mode of administration of drugs is a principal mode of administration in palliative care we practice. And the dose may be reduced in elderly to 0.25 to 0.5 milligram instead of 1 to 2 milligram. And the maximum dose can be 15 milligram over 24 hours in elderly, and in younger patients it may go up to 20 milligram over 24 hours. And if there is a previous history of extrapyramidal side effect, we can choose atypical antipsychotics or newer antipsychotics like olanzapine, risperidone, and quetiapine. And remember, quetiapine is available only in the oral form, as to my knowledge, whereas risperidone and olanzapine can be administered parenterally. Olanzapine is available as mouth melting tablets as well, so that makes administration easily. And benzodiazepine, these are indicated in hyperactive delirium and delirium resulting from alcohol withdrawal. That is, those two are the condition where actually we require benzodiazepine. Midazolam, 1 to 2 milligram every 2 hourly, or PRN, or subcutaneous. Subcutaneous or intravenously. Maximum dose is 30 milligram over 24 hours. I think the last line is not visible. It is lorazepam. Lorazepam, 0.5 to 1 milligram every 2 hourly, up to a maximum of 4 milligram over 24 hours. Next slide, please. Delirium and benzodiazepines. Avoid benzodiazepine monotherapy. Administering benzodiazepines alone, that is not indicated at all. That is that can be given only when the delirium is related to alcohol or benzodiazepine withdrawal. Otherwise, delirium management should be accompanied by the prescription of antipsychotic. Remember, antipsychotics are the drugs of choice, and it may be complemented by benzodiazepine only if the patient is restless, or if you suspect delirium is associated with alcohol withdrawal or benzodiazepine withdrawal. Next slide. This is something like a delirium pathway. This is very useful for elderly patients. Whenever any patient who gets admitted in the hospital, just do a risk assessment. See whether the patient is more than 65 years old, and whether the patient is having a severe illness like either cardiovascular or hepatic or renal or severe sepsis or whatever it is. Not whether the patient is having dementia, and not whether he or she is having physical frailty, infection. See whether the patient is dehydrated, whether the patient is having any sensory impairment, whether the patient is with multiple drugs prescribed for varying reasons like polypharmacy, any metabolic dysfunction, psychotropic medication, and whether in pain or not, or if the patient is catheterized and not the bowel habits. And this is the risk assessment. Wherever we go wrong, or we just assess something negative for each category, see that this patient is a potential candidate for developing delirium. If the patient is aged, severe illness, demented, physically weak, dehydrated, catheterized, constipated, in pain, on psychotropic medicine, polypharmacy, metabolic dysfunction, sensory impairment in elderly patients, see this patient is in risk for delirium. And then assess different, nurses task, whether the patient is, going in for infection. Though, febrile reactions are uncommon in elderly patient, they can keep a TPR chart, take ECG and blood glucose and medication review, omit and delete whichever possible, pain review, assess for urinary retention and constipation, assess hydration, check blood labs, and review ECG, and then manage it accordingly. So this is the delirium pathway, risk assessment and management. This can be followed so that any patient or every patient who is in risk for delirium can be identified easily, and delirium can be prevented whenever and wherever possible. Delirium should be prevented rather than treated. Next slide, please. So conclude. Slide. Next slide. And it's distressing for because about 40% of the survivors have distressing memories, and it is distressing for relatives and for the caring team. And thank you very much. That ends my presentation. Oh, sorry. I forgot that. Let us recap. So again, an elderly woman is brought to the emergency room with complaints of altered behavior noticed by the family members for past 2 days. We are coming back to the history again. Talking incoherently, appears confused. She is diabetic, hypertensive, and is reported to be well controlled, and has been complaining of burning maturation and increased frequency for a couple of days, and oral intake is, for past 1 week is slow. So, next please. Next slide. Yes. So please put in the chat box what are the causative factors, what could be the precipitating factors, and what all things do you assess, and what all things would you do to manage this patient. These are the discussion points. And if there is someone to help me with the chat box, that would be fine. Or I can. Okay. UTI may be a causative factor. Dr. Annie says old age. Yeah, she's 70 plus. UTI, old age. Hyponatremia. Why do you say that it is hyponatremia, Dr. Sheila?
I want to say that it can be. We have to rule out hyponatremia.
Yeah, she was on, hydrochlorothiazide, no?
Diuretic and cause hyponatremia.
Diuretic is diuretic, and she is not taking orally as well. So there could be hyponatremia, definitely hypoglycemia, because
hypoglycemia could be because she's diabetic and not taking oral intake is poor.
Dehydration. Yeah. She also was on some other medication, no?
Medication for sleeping, insomnia, ma'am.
It could be insomnia, sleep disturbance. Yes, that's a very good point. Sleep disturbance also can worsen delirium. She is, hypertensive. We have to look for that as well, whether there is hypertensive encephalopathy or some vascular. We don't know. And what about constipation? Elderly women having catheterization.
UTI is a causative factor or a precipitative factor, ma'am? It is a precipitating factor, no?
Yes. Of course, urinary retention and fecal impaction, they are precipitating factors only. Causative, as you said, it could be infection, age, like hypertensive encephalopathy, metabolic dysfunction like hypoglycemia, or we don't know, it could be hyperglycemia as well. It is rare, but hyponatremia, some other metabolic derangement, we don't know what it is. Renal parameters were normal, which is not clearly given in the history. Constipation is a precipitating factor. Infection, definitely it is a primary or positive factors. Agree. Someone wants to see case once again. Previous slide, Arun, please. electrolyte disturbance. I mean, don't get focused only on UTI alone. I mean, any type of infection and UTI may flare exist in an elderly person.
Dehydration.
Sorry?
Dehydration.
Oral intake has been low for the past 1 week. So hypoglycemia and dehydration and probably hypertensive encephalopathy.
Could be.
All of this, plus because of the low intake, she's developed a burning micturition, which has actually precipitated for the past 2 days. It has precipitated the attack of delirium. Could that be the course of events?
Yeah. So we have to think all the possibilities, like diabetic ketoacidosis also. I mean, like if she's dehydrated, there is a propensity for her developing even CVA as well. That also, I mean, I am not saying that this is the particular cause, but all these things should be considered. And one of my close relatives, you know, he presented he had delirium. On investigation, it was found to be pneumonia. He never had any typical symptom of pneumonia at all. Pneumonia with hyponatremia he had.
One doctor has written about impending stroke. Is it a sign of impending stroke, ma'am?
Yeah.
What do you recommend? Yeah, it could be because of that. Somebody has written that also. What's your comment on that, ma'am?
Yes, it is possible. It is possible. We cannot rule out that. But if we can find out a cause even before that, like if it is hypoglycemia, and if we can correct it, and if the patient comes back, then we don't have to subject the patient to an unnecessary CT. That is what. Certain lab things, we can get it even faster.
Organic causes like subdural.
Subdural hematoma may be suspected.
SDH.
Okay, it may be suspected if the family gives a history of trauma.
Hypertensive, old. No.
It is possible, but you know, in hypertensive patients, subarachnoid hemorrhage is common. It's much more common than subdural hematoma. Subdural hematoma typically occurs following a trauma, but that also is possible. And she's elderly woman. She might have sustained a fall, which was, you know, she might not have thought that it's very significant. In the family also haven't noticed that. So it is very possible that she might have developed a slow subdural hematoma. That also is possible, but no, we have to think many possibilities. See, I didn't say anything. You only suggested all these factors. So see what all causes could be there behind this particular clinical presentation. Okay, so that makes things complex. So first, I would say that this patient should be evaluated quickly and send labs and assess her hydration status and get the lab reports as early as possible and correct if there is anything correctable. And blood sugar values and electrolytes values are nowadays, it is very, we can get it very quickly. So once there is nothing, we can decide that once there is nothing wrong with the lab values, then probably we can take the patient for a imaging, like for a CT or MRI or whatever it is, so that we can pinpoint to primary CNS cause like a bleeding or infarct or hematoma formation. We don't know, it could be a tumor as well. Okay, a frontal lobe tumor also with surrounding edema also can present like that. Okay then, thanks for, there are two more, I think. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. Assessment is over, and what do you give?
To treat the cause, ma'am. First find out the cause and then treat the cause with, if it is metabolic and like hypertension.
Correct the correctables.
Correct the correctables, ma'am.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. But when the patient is brought to the emergency room, she is very restless and, you know, struggling and, you know, fighting and beating the family. Haloperidol. What precaution will you take when you administer haloperidol to an elderly woman? Not some sedation. We cannot have some sedation. We have to be precise. We have to be precise. No sedation, no sedation. And how are you going to assess the patient once we are sedated? What is the drug of choice? If you are suspecting delirium, the drug of choice is antipsychotic. EPS is a possibility. EPS is a possibility in elderly women without a previous history of extrapyramidal side effect. You can always give a low dose of haloperidol. For haloperidol is safe. Midazolam can worsen. Midazolam or lorazepam can worsen the situation. So never push midazolam if you as the first line of treatment. If you suspect the patient is in delirium and it is not because of benzodiazepine or alcohol withdrawal. And in hyperactive delirium, you may give midazolam as a complementary therapy to antipsychotic, not as a first line treatment. Remember that. Only antipsychotic can clear affected consciousness of the cognitive impairment. If the patient gives a previous... Sorry?
Ma'am, you can continue.
Okay. If the patient gives previous history of extrapyramidal side effect, olanzapine is the choice. Only thing is that it is an intramuscular injection, but if the patient can keep the tablet in the mouth melting tablets are available. But it is said that quetiapine is safer drug in elderly people. But low dose haloperidol is still holds good. It's always it's a very super drug. So I think it is time to move to the case presentation by the participants. Shall we? I think this is the last slide. See the next slide, Arun? Okay. Thank you.
Madam, before moving on to the case presentation, if they have any doubt, let them know. Any more doubts?
In fact, I didn't ask your input. You also can contribute. My job is done. You can contribute.
Yeah, okay. Anybody want to ask anything or your experience?
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Like recently, last February, I had lost my grandfather. He was like 90 years old, and he was like he had a history.
I can't properly.
Okay. Am I audible now, ma'am?
I think there is somebody else's audio is audible.
Okay. Can others please mute?
Am I audible now, ma'am?
There is a lot of background voice. I don't know from whom it's coming. Can you see and mute them?
Ma'am, I think it's some from the background only, from Dr. Sheila Rathod.
Okay. Please continue.
Is it okay now, ma'am?
Yes.
So recently I lost my grandfather in the month of February. He was like 90 years old and known case of hypertension. 2 years back, he was diagnosed with dementia. His treating physician had diagnosed him. And then slowly, he had a history of talking with incoherent speech. And at that time, they were diagnosed as hyponatremia. Twice or thrice, he was diagnosed with hyponatremia. So they used to restrict his fluid, and he used to be fine with that. And then he was also put on QTPin, and he had visual hallucinations also. So they thought that hallucinations are part of dementia, and they put him on QTPin. And he had insomnia, so they put him on lorazepam also. In the month of October, he had a history of stroke, a mild weakness, hemiparesis in the left. So we did a CT scan and we found a little weakness. There was a small infarct, which the doctors told nothing to do much because of his age. So during the last days, what I want to say is, he used to sleep for 2 days continuously, and then he used to be hyperactive for 1 day. Like he used to be wake up for like 36 hours on a stretch, and he used to talk incoherently and all. So was that delirium, or that was that a part of dementia, or that was end of life? After listening to this class, I'm failing to understand that actually.
Sorry, after listening to the class, you are confused, or?
I'm confused that was that delirium, or was that end of life? Because like 10 days before his death, he used to sleep for 2 days, and then not 10 days, like 15, 20 days. It was like he used to sleep for 2 days, he used to be wake up for 2 days, he used to sleep for 2 days and wake up for 2 days. Sleep cycle was like that. Or sometimes in the entire night he used to be wake up, and then sometimes he was very quiet, very slow and all, and sometimes he used to be hyperactive. He used to abuse and all. So was all this delirium, or was all this a part of dementia? Because since 2 years he was on treatment for dementia.
See, I mean, Sheila, what I have understood from the history is that an elderly person who is in 90s and who is already a demented, a patient with dementia, diagnosed dementia, is quite vulnerable to catch delirium, particularly when he reaches the last days of life. So, from my understanding, it could be delirium over dementia, which had, appeared quite frequently, because delirium, as we had seen, it is transient and acute. But his delirium might be coming and going and coming and going like that. That is very common towards end of life phase in many patients. And we see that even younger patients who are approaching end of life phase. But these are very common in elderly people, particularly when they have a serious illness, or if they are having dementia. This is very common. I think from the history and from my understanding, it is delirium over dementia.
He was already on Qutipin and lorazepam since 7 to 8 months, ma'am. So then Qutipin wouldn't have taken care of the delirium?
Yes, yes. These are, I mean, we have seen that pharmacological measures will help, but not by 100%. In some patients, they will be helpful in controlling the symptoms totally, but in some group of patients, it will be helpful in alleviating the symptoms, not completely. And we need to be with the patient, and it is very difficult, and we have to be in touch with the the surroundings as well. Like we have to take care of the general measures as well. That is what I mean. So pharmacological measures give only 50% of the total management pattern. The rest of the things are for nursing management or general care. Okay, and with this, even terminal delirium, when it occurs towards the end of life phase, it is a symptom or a syndrome which is very difficult to control with pharmacological measures alone. And some people, they require continuous subcutaneous infusion of haloperidol. We used to give it in the hospital, and also in some patients who can, give it to the patient in a sensible manner, like a trained family caregiver. They can give intermittent bolus to the patient even at the home setting.
So haloperidol should have been given, ma'am. That's what I wanted to ask. That did we miss something on the treatment? After listening to this class, I feel like.
Sorry, it is not clear to me.
Did we miss something on the treatment? Should he?
That is what. Sometimes he might require. He might have require like a continuous, not that intermittent oral dose of Qutipin. Qutipin is available only as an oral dose. So instead of that, I think only I assume that he would have been better if there had been a subcutaneous infusion. Generally with an antipsychotic, which is supplemented by a benzodiazepine whenever it is required. And there is a question, how can we differentiate hypoactive delirium and a person who simply has lost the zest of life? This is very difficult. Only thing is that, we have to relate the present condition with the past, how he was the previous day, or how he was a couple of days ago. So if you feel that the appearance and the demeanor is different, if the behavior is different and his appearance is different and his response is different, so then we have to suspect delirium. In hypoactive delirium, it is quite often missed also. Only thing is that we have to relate it to how the patient's behavior pattern during the previous days. Is abusive language more due to dementia or due to delirium? It is common with in both situations, because dementia is definitely, there is a loss of comprehension and cognition. So in dementia, that will be almost continuous. In delirium also, when there is a transient disruption in the cognitive faculty, that could happen, but definitely that will not be sustained or within it. That will happen only when the patient is delirious. After that, he will come back to his normal behavior pattern. But dementia, it will be almost persistent. But it is not using abusive language it's not a must. I have seen patients with dementia and delirium who have been behaving rather or speaking much better than the so-called normal people. Only thing is that we will not be in a position to comprehend or understand what they speak. Not that they use like abusive language.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. I'm clear now.
Okay. So I think now we can move on to the patient story, which will be presented by Dr. Melita.
Good evening, everyone. The case that I'm presenting is a patient. It's a posthumous presentation. I'm Dr. Melita, and I'm working in Nashik in a government setup. So I want to thank the palliative team for giving me this opportunity. As the case presentation goes, it's a lady, 63-year-old, and she had a history of carcinoma of the left breast, and I'm not able to enlarge the screen.
If you are on a mobile, you can actually try to enlarge with your two fingers.
On biweekly dialysis. Her presenting complaints, she had decreasing appetite for 3 months and inability to sleep for 2 weeks, drowsiness during the day, irritable and incoherent speech for 10 days, and unpredictable behavior for 1 week, not recognizing family members for 1 week. The history of illness, the patient had CA breast diagnosed and treated 10 years ago. She's been a diabetic as well as a hypertensive with ischemic heart disease for the last 15 years. She underwent biweekly hemodialysis for 2 years. There was anxiety and erratic behavior for 3 months and confusion for 1 week. On examination, her general condition was quite poor. There was pallor, there were dark circles around her eyes, there was fetal edema, and her vital parameters were okay. Her major systems, cardiovascular, respiratory, abdomen, were normal. There was no organomegaly. And local examination, there was a healthy mastectomy scar. Treatment and significant investigation. Treatment she required was a biweekly dialysis because of her CRF. Her blood urea was in the range of 140 to 160 milligram per deciliter. Her serum creatinine was 3.5 to 4 plus. She had altered electrolytes. There was hyponatremia. There was hypercalcemia. Her total proteins were low, and also her blood gases showed metabolic acidosis. Her hemoglobin was around 8. The psychosocial aspects of her: she was a retired widow with 2 married daughters with a stable marriage. 1 daughter was unmarried, 1 son with a difficult marriage and impending court case. The financial burden of ongoing medical treatment was upon her, and she needed help for all her personal care, and she had an in-house nurse who looked after her. The medications she was on was antidiabetics, antihypertensives, anxiolytics, supportive therapy. And on the right side, we have the drugs that she was basically on. Of course, there were other tablets also that she took, but these were the main course of treatment that she was on. That was Citapen, Thelma, Clopilot, Pan-40, Alprax, Isabgol, and multivitamins. Our main concern with this patient is to control her acute erratic behavioral changes, to ensure good quality of life, and also the caregivers were very disturbed and were burnt out, so they required counseling. Summary of this case: a 63-year-old widow, a cancer survivor with non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus with ischemic heart disease and chronic renal failure, on biweekly dialysis, presenting with delirium as seen by altered behavior, altered sleep pattern, and weakness. So as we conclude here, we can take this forward, discussing and seeing how we could have given her better care maybe. So the causes of delirium in this case would be her uremia and her altered metabolites, and also that her biweekly hemodialysis required hospital stay, and she never really did very well during the procedure as well as after. So that whole process was very traumatic for her. She did have an altered sleep pattern, which was probably multifocal. Like she had a lot of psychosocial issues as well, a lot of concern about her family and her own future. And also maybe her altered metabolites would have given her, this sort of a delirium. And the altered sleep pattern was very evident in her. And she did not recognize her own family members and the caregivers who were with her all the time. And to a certain extent, she was a little abusive and very angry and curt to those who were, actually expressing love and concern for her. So we could take the discussion forward. So I'll ask Dr. Sunil and Madam Jayashree to.
Thank you, Dr. Melita. Old lady with altered behavior. So she was diagnosed to have a carcinoma of the breast 15 years back, now on hemodialysis. So anybody can comment on any of the questions Dr. Melita raised. What are the causes of delirium? And what can be done to modify the speech? And how will you differentiate between the delirium and dementia?
Somebody's asked if there was brain mets. No, she did not have any metastasis. Her scans were normal. CT scan brain.
Okay.
Hyponatremia also?
Yeah, she has.
Yes, she had hyponatremia, hypercalcemia, yes. And maybe she would have had, metabolic. Yes, she was in uremia. Correct. Thank you, Dr. Angela. Actually, what sort of counseling we can give the caregivers and the help that they need, no? And how well we could have treated her at this phase.
Any other causes of delirium?
Her appetite was also low for a few weeks prior to this incident.
About fecal infection or urine infection, ma'am, does that rule out?
It could be a possibility, but she was on Isabgol, and once in a while she would require manual removal as well. Or an enema.
I can see many comments.
Yes, UTI.
Concerns about could it be response to sense issues, psychosocial issues, infections like UTI?
Yes, actually, her son's problem was of much concern to her, and it really weighed her down towards the last few weeks of her life. And also the unmarried daughter.
Okay.
She did not have hypoglycemia to that extent. It was more on the higher side.
That's another. Would you like to?
Hyperglycemia, was it? I believe it was not that high to produce delirium.
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, you're right. It wasn't so high, but it was always on the higher side for her. Like it was always in the range of 150, 160.
Oh.
No antipsychotic, not on a long-term basis, maybe just symptomatic, but the main medication was only Alprax. So as we went through the lecture this evening, I realized like maybe that wasn't the right choice for her. Maybe some haloperidol on a consistent basis would have given her a better quality of life. And also it would have, given less pain to the caregivers.
Ma'am, I have a doubt. If you give haloperidol, will the abusive or the use of hurtful language or that sort of a behavior, will it get controlled with the haloperidol to a certain extent at least?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
No, I'm asking whether if this in this case, suppose we had given haloperidol, would it have controlled the language, abusive language? See, ultimately after she's gone away, we still remember that those last few days. I think she was, that's what we tend to remember. So would it have helped to reduce that? What is that we can do for that sort of a, that leaves a lasting scar on the caregiver? It's a difficult question. But
only assumption based on probability, because usually haloperidol helps in this situation. We can't say that haloperidol helps all the time, but definitely haloperidol, it is worth a trial. In this situation, I would have tried with haloperidol first and see how things are, whether it is getting better or not, then reassess regularly and frequently, and then modify the medications and see her, medication history, whether there was any new medicines added which might have contributed. That is one thing. As you have rightly pointed out, there are multiple causes in this case with a long history of diabetes producing nephropathy. So kidney is, malfunctioning. So there are every chance for she goes ups and downs in her, metabolic parameters. So it's very common for her to become delirious and coming back to normal and again go back. So this is very common. Along with that, she might be having other comorbidities. We don't know, like it's when kidneys fail, it is not that kidneys only fail. It will have the repercussions on other organs as well. So slowly the system was shutting. And again, malignancy, anyway, you have rolled out cerebral metastasis. But malignancy, I don't know the present status, whether it was active or not. If that is active in one or other manner, it is a pro-inflammatory, pro-thrombotic state. It is like that. So an ongoing inflammatory process will just result in inflammatory, that chain of reactions and the associated changes. And the pro-thrombotic phase also can result in microinfarcts. That these are the remote possibilities I am telling. And delirium in any patient is a common finding. It is one of the most common finding or symptom towards last end of life phase. And I mean, there need not be a precise or specific cause which we can pinpoint and manage. That is why it is said many times it remains refractory when it occurs towards end of life. There it may not be reversible. The causative factor cannot be identified altogether, and it cannot be reversible. So it may remain refractory to management. So here we may have to give a combination of drugs, like first with drugs like antipsychotic drugs. I prefer haloperidol, and if you are not comfortable with haloperidol, any other antipsychotic would be the choice, but antipsychotic should be given. And if required, if you want to make her a little more comfortable, it's not only to avoid abusive language, to make her comfortable so that her last days were memorable to the living people also. To make a comfortable or calm goodbye, then we may add benzodiazepines if indicated, but definitely Alprax is not a good choice from my end. I am not criticizing any person, but I never use Alprax. I invite comments from other eminent and expert people in this group. I could find a couple of people from India as well as from abroad. Please contribute. Even parenteral or sublingual lorazepam or parenteral midazolam is safe to administer at home. Only thing is that we have to accept that these drugs can be given. It will not produce respiratory depression. It will not produce hemodynamic fluctuation if these are administered judiciously. That is something which we have to carry in our mind. Always we are so much afraid of opioids, giving morphine and giving midazolam. It is not so. We are not going to resuscitate this patient from a medical emergency. So definitely we can try these drugs to make the patient comfortable. Again, the family has to be communicated quite frequently, because one-time communication alone will not be sufficient. They have to be aware of what is happening to their, their loved one, and how it is likely to produce, and in what all way they can cope up, and what all manner they can offer support to the patient. It's not only that their coping mechanism, how they can remain as they can be there as a very supportive caregiver. That confidence also should be built in.
Rajeshri, Odette here. So I think you've covered everything very beautifully, and the discussion's been really helpful, I think, for looking at the nitty-gritty of it all. But I agree with that we would use antipsychotics as the sort of class of drugs of choice. So haloperidol or olanzapine, as you mentioned, and then there's another one we use sometimes, which is a kind of phenothiazine called methotrexate, but I don't think it's available. Is it available in India?
Sorry, Odette, I didn't hear that.
Levothyroxine or methotrexate, Nozonan?
No, it is not available.
No, that's right. But I don't think it's, with olanzapine and haloperidol, that's generally very manageable. And it's a bit like pain management, isn't it? That you can titrate the dose, because you're not aiming for deep sedation, you're aiming for sort of control of behavior to a degree that makes it safe for the patient and perhaps less distressing for the family. So, and as you mentioned, the counseling the family and explaining the behavior to them is really important, because it can be very, very distressing for the family to see the behavior, if it's out of character of their family member. And also I think patients who recover from delirium often remember their behavior. I think you touched on that, and can be quite embarrassed by it or quite distressed by it. And even hypoactive delirium can be remembered as a very distressing experience. So it is important to treat it as a symptom, just like any other symptom that we treat. Does that make sense?
Thanks. Yeah, of course. Definitely.
Of course it does. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, ma'am.
Pleasure. Thank you. I learn a lot. As I said to Rajeshri, I learn a lot in these discussions, because it's the real world complexity. It's not an easy condition to manage. And having that presence of a family member, I think that's where you're at an advantage often in India, that you do have the family around the patient in hospital. Perhaps not so much with COVID. I don't know what sort of restrictions here we've found, with visiting restrictions during COVID. We've had a lot more trouble with patients with delirium and falling out of beds and so on, because the family members are so important in helping the confused patient to kind of maintain some sense of themselves. Familiar. Somebody mentioned in the questions about whether ICU or with family, and personally I think ICU is one of the most depersonalizing environments and very likely to aggravate delirium. What do you think?
Ma'am, can I ask a doubt, ma'am?
Sorry?
Yeah.
Like when we give haloperidol to a patient with delirium, and then once that acute episode resolves, so do we stop it abruptly, or we taper and stop? I mean, how does it happen generally? Or then how long can we give, or we can give it indefinitely in a patient with dementia? Or it's like steroids, how we give that we taper and stop it, don't stop abruptly. Is it the same with antipsychotics also?
Would you like me to comment on that, or would you like Rajeshri to?
Odit, you are welcome, but I don't think it is necessary to taper. But only thing is that I used to continue it for a couple of days more and then make it PRN and see whether the patient becomes comfortable or not. That is the practice which I used to do. I mean, there is nothing like tapering and stopping, which I have done in my practice. Odit, you are welcome.
No, I agree. I mean, it's important to remember that a lot of the antipsychotics, including haloperidol, do have anticholinergic components to them, which can also aggravate delirium. And there's some charts for the anticholinergic load of many of the medications. So it's quite surprising sometimes just how much anticholinergic sort of component exists in drugs, even non-steroidals, as I recall. So we have, unfortunately, the drugs we're using to treat can also cause problems. So it is a good idea to try and reduce and stop anything really where possible, but probably tapering, as you say. But if delirium, if the underlying cause of the delirium is reversible, then we may not need to continue the antipsychotic if they recover. But again, it depends very much on the clinical situation. If it's a terminal delirium, often we need to continue till death. And often it's very multifactorial, as you've come out with all the causes that you identify in these cases that were discussed, isn't it? So hard to reverse often.
Ma'am, regarding the hospital, ICU or home, and regarding counseling, I want to know if the counseling should be now more focused on the caregivers rather than the patient, because I think if you give a proper counseling to the caregivers and then keep them at home, wouldn't that be the ideal situation? Is my line of thinking right?
Could you just repeat that? I didn't get it in full.
So there were two questions, one on counseling and one on whether we should have the patient on ICU and or on at home. So I want to know whether the counseling should be focused on the caregivers, because they will not they will not know that it is not intentional on the part of the patient. And once that is done, then the ideal situation is to have them at home and in a very familiar situation. Isn't that the ideal?
Well, I would like to say that I would call it as communication rather than counseling, because counseling, to my understanding, it differs a lot from communication. So an appropriate communication with the family member, so probably a family meeting would be much better, so that they will be informed what is happening. That is very important. Okay. And they have a right, and we have the duty also to tell them what is happening to the patient and how is likely to proceed further. That is one answer. And the second thing is, and if you find that the cause can be found out and correctable, definitely the patient should be admitted in the hospital, because hospital offers a system where you can get an access to labs and immediate measures to correct the corrections. That is well accepted. But if you feel that a patient with advanced malignancy with multiple comorbidities like liver failure, who is getting renal replacement therapy in the form of biweekly dialysis, she's just approaching her last phase of life. So in such situation, I would prefer the professional should communicate to the family that this is the situation, and we are not going to get much. Make her better by admitting her in the hospital. These are the possibilities. So the symptom control may be offered at home in the following manner, for which they may be empowered how to carry out the proper the appropriate instructions at home. Those things they can be empowered. So if I were the patient, if I am able to communicate, or if I were the family caregiver in that position, I would like to take the patient home so that I can be with the patient at my home. And the third thing is that if I were the professional, I would have communicated to the family that, see, this is a situation, this is the best thing which the hospital can offer you, but that is nothing more in the sense, nothing more the particular admission will give you. So it is always better to take the patient home with the following advices, so that you can carry out it comfortably at home, and you can contact us formally or informally over phone or video call or whatever it is, and you can be with the patient at home, so that the patient can live as comfortably as possible. This is the kind of communication I would like to offer, and I would prefer to hear. That is my take. Please, Sunil and Odette.
Thank you so much, ma'am. I think that explains a lot, actually. It gives a lot of dimension. I think Sunil sir had written a lot of inputs in the chat box
also. I see there is another question on hyperactive delirium and drug management. So I see a lot of literatures now which are coming. Previously, we were stressing more on symptomatic treatment with antipsychotic agents, but now we are the literatures are more on non-pharmacological management of delirium. So the non-pharmacological management should be instituted early. So if the patient is in a hospital, please try to keep him near a window so that he can see outside and he can differentiate between the day and night. So and let him see the outside so that he can his some of the cognitive environment can be can change, and it will be good to keep clock, calendar, etc. to make him orient in time. And if you have albums, let him, you should show him and ask him at what time this photo was taken and who all are there, etc. And if he's a person who is wearing a glass, then he should be allowed to wear watch, to use mobile phones, etc. So all those normal things should happen so that there will be a better orientation in time, place, and person. And another thing is that he should be mobilized early. Early mobilization in delirium is supposed to resolve delirium easily. So the patient should be mobilized with a caregiver. Then, so the non-pharmacological management has a very good role in managing delirium. And it is there was a question regarding how can we correct the sleep pattern. So one of the things is during that time the room should be well lit, and he should be able to make the difference between day and night. So it's so that the patient knows when to sleep and when to wake up. So that's one thing. And along with that, if correction of the possible precipitating factors should also be done. And the antipsychotics can also help him to settle down if non-pharmacological management fails.
Thank you, Sunil. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
And another question, Dr. Melita asked, how do you differentiate between delirium and dementia?
I'll share myself.
Yeah. Madam, would you like to talk?
Anything?
No, Dr. Melita was asking how to differentiate between delirium and dementia.
I think we have discussed that dementia is slow in onset. Delirium is, we can pick out it rather easily because it occurs over a period of days or hours. And dementia, we can definitely note that the decline in the cognitive abilities are slow to evolve and appear. And it is quite insidious. It's very common in elderly people and old people. Usually they will have mild cognitive impairment to begin with, which may progress to different stages of dementia depending on the pathology. And delirium is totally different. Sudden abnormal, irrelevant, sudden abnormal behavior with irrelevant talk. That develops over a period of short span of time. So if that develops over a period of a couple of days or a few hours, then it is definitely delirium. It can occur on a patient with dementia. But the dementia features will be there typically present for past many weeks or many months. Hope I made sense.
Yes, ma'am. Your lecture was also very clear. Those questions I had put before the lectures.
Okay. And
so
another thing which I think is short-term memory will be impaired in delirium, definitely. But dementia, it need not be like that always.
Yeah. And there is another question, is delirium common in children? I have much less exposure and experience with pediatric patients, but children they belong to the other end of that whole life spectrum. So unless the child is in a compromised state like organ dysfunction or some neurological infection or other neurological factors, it is not as common as in adults. That is what I can say. I'm not a pediatrician and I have much, practically no experience with pediatric patients. Sunil, do you have something to offer and add to?
No, I also see the pediatric patients once in a while. Audit, do you have?
In hematogenous oncology with spinal and brain infiltration, so probably it may be common, I mean, like with encephalitis or infections like that. Other illnesses which we commonly attribute to adult population is strikingly absent in pediatric age group. So I don't think it is that common, but it might occur with CNS infiltration of the malignancy or encephalitis, I believe. But I think she can contribute.
I think she left.
She left. Oh, then we
are. I think we can wind up this session. So delirium is a common neuropsychiatric problem in not only in palliative care patients but also in any other patients having medical conditions, and it is very common in patients who are admitted in ICU. So unfamiliar surroundings is one of the precipitating factors of delirium. And we know that the patients with advanced stage, advanced malignancy, and patients with dementia are factors which are predisposing factors for delirium. And there are factors for which Dr. Gayatri has given you an acronym, and as she told, there are many acronyms. But the most important precipitating factors are constipation, hypoglycemia, hyponatremia, hypercalcemia, infections, and medications like anticholinergics, opioids, benzodiazepines, tricyclic antidepressants, then bladder outlet obstruction, then hypoxia and unrelieved pain. All these are common precipitating factors in palliative care. And delirium can occur, it has three varieties: hyperactive delirium, and mixed delirium. And mixed delirium is the commonest one. If the patient has delirium, then we have to rule out the common factors which can precipitate delirium, which I have already explained. Constipation, urinary retention, any other medications that is going to precipitate. And according to the patient, you have to investigate if the prognosis is poor, you have to think whether should I investigate this patient? Will it be beneficial for the patient? So then only you will go for more investigation. So non-pharmacological management is the important thing which you have to start earlier. And if the patient is agitated, then definitely you have to use antipsychotics and the proper communication is important with the patient and also with the caregivers. I think those are the some of the important points. So we should not miss delirium because it is equally distressing, not only for the patient but also for the caregiver. Not only for the caregiver from patient side, but also for the professional caregivers like doctors and nurses. It would be very difficult for us to understand what the patient is telling because it is incoherent. They may not be attending. It's also a problem for us. So there are many tools which can be used to detect delirium. Like the gold standard is DSM-5. Then there are many other tools, and one of the simplest tool is confusion assessment method, which can be used. So thank you, Gayatri Madam, for being with us and having a wonderful class on delirium. And thank you, Melita, for patient story, which is very suitable for this session. And thank you all for active participation. Thank you.
Thank you,
Over
sir.
to Arun.
Thank you, Sunil.